Hello, everyone. Welcome to kind of our only recorded Decoding Human Behavior book club series. So, this is a special edition simply because I have the opportunity to interview one of our authors of a book that we had a chance to talk about earlier. And now that it's finally out, we can dissect it a bit further in that process. I have with me Brian Donovan, who is an executive leadership coach. Hi, Brian. How are you?
Great, Elsa. Fabulous to be here with you.
Likewise. So we originally met under one of the programs that both you and I are involved in with Influential You, which is uh, a, really a platform to help you develop in different areas of life. But I think both of our focus was much more on the professional side. And since then, you told me about the book, and I'd love to know more about the concept. The book is called The Gentle Art of Leadership, which is kind of a concept that most people don't think about when they think of leadership. So tell me a little bit more about how the concept of the book came out.
Yes, Elsa. Well, look, lovely to be here with you, and thanks for your support and encouragement along the way. Full disclosure, we should also say that you're featured in the book, along with 50 leaders from around the globe that we interviewed. But look, I've probably got to go way back in time to give the origin of the book. And a true confession, Elsa, I'm just springing this on you really. I'm was brought up a gentleman. I know that's a bit old-fashioned in some circles, and I've tried to be the extroverted, outgoing kind of leader, and it never really quite worked. My dad taught me how to be a gentleman, and really the gentle bit is a key part of the book. All the best leaders I've ever had treated people well, treated people with dignity and respect, and brought out the best in them. And they weren't just men; they were gentle women as well. So that's really a bit of the background to, what are the kind of leaders who have influenced us? I'm sure when we talked, you had your role models. They were the ones that you didn't want to be like, those aggressive, let's call it out, those jerks that you really didn't really want to work with. You thought, I'm not going to be like that. But the ones who were able to connect with you, I'm sure that's true for people watching and listening now, the ones who could connect with you and take an interest in you, who believed in you, they're the ones that had you go the extra mile. And that's what we wanted to write about. It's not something that you often hear about. I asked a colleague of mine, Dean Phelan, who's got a good psychology background, and we drew on a lot of his research, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so he's my co-author in the book. And we both have a similar outlook, and we wanted to test that with people in the marketplace. So really great to talk with you about it today because I know you also believe in the human-centric approach and the results it yields. But let me just pause there and see where you want to go from there.
Yeah, and I think part of the interesting component is it's very easy to have a book called The Gentle Art of Leadership and it be very much an op-ed piece. And it seems like you've gone the exact opposite of that, where you have extensive research and in addition to real life scenarios, which is how you and I got connected into me being, interviewed for the book. Um, so that's just such an interesting juxtaposition, I think, when you start a book called The Gentle Art of Leadership and you have access to 6,000 360 feedbacks that you can peruse through and synthesize. Tell me a bit more about what that process looked like and how you and your co-author Dean kind of walked through that initial phase.
Yes, great question. Well, Dean, as you said, my co-author, had a background in a company that was providing human resources services, including 360-degree reviews of leaders. And over time, interviewed about 6,000 leaders, and through that process, categorized the key qualities or attributes, you might say, of a great leader. often we ask ourselves, well, what's a great leader look like? Well, the framework that Dean got from actual interviews with people turned into the 8 of the chapters of our book. Then we decided that we wanted to add a qualitative component, so really test our ideas in the market too, Elsa. So we interviewed, as I mentioned briefly, 50 plus leaders from all around the globe in different industry sectors and asked them what they thought about the gentle art of leadership. Does it fit our assertion that that's how you get the best results? And they really confirmed and gave much more granularity or more depth to the idea that, how do you treat people with dignity and respect, and what are some of the practices, and what were some of the influences that they had. And so the stories are a big part of the book, the research is a big part of the book. We added from the stories another couple of chapters into the structure of the book. So it's really, like you said, not just a couple of guys who had this idea and are now talking about it. We've backed it with then I think the figure is something like 160 books we've looked through and references and articles we've quoted. So it's heavily underpinned by research examples and stories. And if you just dwell a moment on the stories side of it, Elsa, we might talk some more about particular examples, but the stories sort of really illustrated the practices that people adopt in how to get the best from people with this gentle art. And I think the point I'd make about it is they're not typically people you hear from. They're not the noisy ones who are talking about, look at me. They're generally, in fact, yourself included, a bit reluctant to talk about themselves. They say it's really the team that's producing results. But, it took a little bit to coax them into being interviewed and being part of the book. But they're really smart because they're the ones who have a good team because they get the best out of people. They develop them into leaders around them. It's really, really quite smart, but you don't often hear from them. But so that's sort of the spine of the book, the research component, the stories from real world practitioners, and then our own experience that Dean and I had. We both do executive coaching, and we've both been CEOs, been senior executives, so we could bring that into the book as well. Does
Yeah.
that give you some?
I think it's interesting because as I was reading through the book, I'm reminded of an image I was shown, God, years ago, where it talked about where leadership sits, and it was actually it was an image of a bunch of wolves, and walking through a path and going through it, and it kind of talked about the ones on the front are not the leaders. It's actually the ones all the way at the end who are kind of making sure everyone's going in the right direction and kind of watching from behind
Yes.
from it. The ones at the front are those that are kind of the protectors, so to speak, of the pack, but they don't necessarily have the wisdom to guide in that direction. They've already heard from where they should be going, and I think that's one of the most common elements that I read throughout it is it's even anecdotes like from stories around I'm there to create an environment that creates unsupervised direction because I've done the things that I need to do or provided the resources I need to provide so that way the goal can be accomplished. And I don't have to be that person of like, look at me, how great I am. I can just let things transpire and everybody's personal potential can be thrived into that environment. I think that's the most kind of takeaway I got from the book after hearing other people's stories and transparently other things that I could just steal. I'm like, that's a really good idea. I'm gonna adopt that moving forward, and weave it into my strategy because I do think that most people who become leaders don't necessarily have the training, but know the type of leaders that they may not want to be. And that's transparently how I formed a lot of mine is I had a couple of really good ones that I'm like, I like those pieces. And then unfortunately the others have been, here's the recipe that I don't want to include into my leadership style.
Yes.
So I'd like to drill down into a couple of them, specifically around some of the philosophies that other leaders have brought in. One of my favorite being, leave things better than you found them. Can you tell me more about the quote and the interviewer that you had to tell you that process?
Yes, well, I mean, Debbie Taylor Moore was the example that you're referring to. She is the managing director of a company that's just been launched in January, she's based near Washington in Virginia, called Quantum Crunch. And Debbie's influence, one of the questions we asked all of our interviewees was who is a role model who influenced this philosophy that you have about treating people well. And her example was her mother. And her mother always said, leave things better than you found them. So initially that meant do the dishes before you go out and make a tidy house. But Debbie extended that into the relationships around her, the kind of work that she does, and turned it into a beginning of a personal credo that she then developed. We've talked about it in the book, and she believes in big things being possible and being the best wife and mother, and believes in integrity and making a meaningful contribution. All those things kind of stem from her early upbringing and the influence for lots of us. I mentioned my dad as an influence as a gentleman. Those early influences, particularly parental ones, are really strong. So Debbie's taken that idea of particularly leave things better than you found them to great lengths. Is really just quite an inspiring leader. So she's one of the examples we talk about in the book of someone practicing this gentle art. And here's an example of how they practice. And her personal credo that she lives by is a good example.
Yeah, I know. In my instance, a lot of the work that I did was specifically to, how do we become a leader that people want to follow? And in my interview, I specifically talked about, some areas that I kind of checked to say, am I being from an objective perspective, am I offering what I need to offer to my team around am I giving the resources? Am I giving people the right access or the right autonomy to be able to really have that freedom around it? Is there other examples that we kind of weave into the story around this that you'd like to call out in your interviews to say this is who else I think would be a great chapter to review?
Yes.
Um,
Well, I mean, declaring my bias, I think your story was a good one, and maybe we should just have a bit more of a conversation about that because you really brought up a great example applying these kind of principles in your own business, a human-centric approach. That example you talked about, maybe you could, I'll throw it back to you to tell about that example of the return to work policy the company
yeah.
was trying to implement.
So some of our work at BMG is helping organizations really manage the RTO mandates or programs that they want to move into. And the instance that I used in the interview was a case study that we had for an organization that was basically facing a mass exodus of some of their really top engineers, and subsequently all the team members that reported up to them, because the loyalty to those senior engineers was far greater than the loyalty to the brand. And that was after the return to work mandate that came abruptly and pretty sharply in a team that had been remote for the better part of three and a half years. So add that to the fact that they are already maxed out in capacity and are going after the next set of bids and really needed every senior engineer possible to be able to win those next set of bids and really stay competitive and frankly outrank their competitors from that. And transparently, being in a niche area, the beauty of being in niche is your niche. The downside is talent pipeline development takes a while. And so when you lose, four of your 10 major engineers that are part of this program, that's one of the elements that we work through. And our approach is kind of the same as we do internally. I'm very big about practicing what we preach in those, and that's, seeking through inquiry. Like, why is this such a big divide? And sometimes it's, the old reality versus the new reality, and the level of tolerance is different. And other times it could just be as easy as, hey, I have to go drop off my kid, and now my commute is 90 minutes. And I didn't, that wasn't a problem before, but now it is because, daycares close down or move or what have you. And for you to be able to kind of listen to those stories and say, oh, I understand. And to also offer the level of secondary inquiry, because you hear that once and it's like, well, why is your commute 90 minutes and why is that different from before COVID and so on? And then you hear, well, I have to go here and then here and then here. Those are kind of the details, and I think that's one of the things that we do really well in our research transparently is get down to kind of brass tacks of like, what does that mean exactly, and walk us through your lived experience versus the one that we think is there. And I part of that was, just telling the C-suite to say, I understand that this isn't your reality, but this is the reality of the majority of your employees who are parents that are both working, and they have to split times of who picks up their children and who doesn't, and who has aging parents and some of those, and taking that very empathetic approach to people's realities, and also kind of being pretty honest to say that if you don't have that kind of empathy after, one of the largest health crises in the world that we've ever experienced, then maybe there's something that you should do internally to figure out why that is within the C-suite, um, for it, and really kind of then creating a space both in the building, to foster that. So offering the opportunity to build in a daycare. Initially, our thought process was it should just be enough to house a daycare big enough for that particular tenant because they were renting a space. And then when we brought it to the property managers and they brought in the owners, they said, "Well, I'll just open it up to the whole floor because you're telling me it's going to drive occupancy, which is, my source of revenue." So for them to also like really get on, and on the bandwagon, now their property is nearly full up, which is, kind of unheard of in this particular metropolitan area, simply because of that. And then in the actual space, we made sure that nobody was experiencing going into the office and then sitting on a desk with headphones on the entire time because they're stuck in a Zoom meeting, because there's no meeting area, there's no innovation hub, there's no other forms of interaction except for my 2x4 desk that is an open office that I can hear everybody else's conversations around. Those are the empathetic components that we really drove, throughout it. So that's kind of our approach. Is if I think if you're empathetic enough, you're curious enough to ask why, and the further you go down that rabbit hole, the better you'll end up being because you'll actually get the answers that you need as opposed to maybe the ones that you want.
Yes, I love that approach and really emphasizes the empathy and listening. It's come out a lot, not just in your interview, but in several other interviews, that if you're really going to be practicing the gentle art of leadership, you've got to be listening. I mean, one example, just to quickly mention, was Doug Conant, who used to be the CEO of Campbell Soup and took it over at a point when it was really not going very well. His whole human centric approach was summarized in a quote from him. He said, if you want them to be interested in your agenda, you've got to first get interested in their agenda, which is exactly what you did in the return to work example. You got interested in them and what their agenda is and their challenges. And Doug really put that into practice. His proxy for how the company was doing was the employee engagement score, or you might call it employee satisfaction. And I know you've got some strong views on how related those two things are. We probably don't have time to go into that today, but people can surely talk to you about that some more. That there's a lot of evidence that points to employee satisfaction being also a measure of company performance.
Yeah. I think one of the also big components of this book is it goes to a very systematic approach about debunking the myths in pretty great detail about what we think the archetypes of leadership are. There's so many of these stories out there of having that um, verbose, like, I'm charming type of mentality. And the vast majority of, I think, really good leaders have that service mindset of, to your point, aligning agendas and making sure that everyone is feeling like there's a sense of belonging, which is, I think, where the art component really falls into this. There's methodical components that you can address, but that caring component, there was some other areas that you mentioned, and I know we've talked about in the past, around what military does and how from the outside it can seem very systematic and very approached, but then when you start inquiring on what makes really good generals and commanding officers from the bad ones is those that make the rounds and ask people how they're doing and ask them how their families are doing, especially if they're out on duty. So, turning that's such a big symbol of what archetypes can be in leadership as something as big as, the military arm, and seeing like it was actually always there, maybe to an extent. It's just not seen that way from the outside until you're in that conversation.
Yes, it's a great point you're making about the mythology of what makes a great leader. And often it's we look out and we see somebody who's charismatic and extroverted and think, well, if only I could be like them. And often we're just thrust into leadership. You've referred to that before. A lot of people are really unprepared for, maybe coming from some subject matter expertise to now being put into a role which is essentially about getting results through people and have had little development, little focus on, how do you do that? And so sometimes they look out and say, oh, well, there's this kind of bright, shiny, charismatic looking one. Maybe I should be like them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for me, in my career, Elsa, the relief that I got was I don't have to be that way. I can be the authentic way that I am. I can be more of me, if you like, and be successful. What a freedom for people to have to go, you don't have to be this kind of image that you've often seen in movies and portrayed in books that people write about themselves. You don't have to be that one. You can be yourself and be interested in people. And the research supports that is going to get you the best results. So why wouldn't you?
Yeah, that's such a good point. Like, there is no personality compliance that you have to adhere to. And frankly, there's also no, looking at the leaders that you interviewed, everything is these massive companies all the way down to small startups. So it's so applicable across any type of leader, whether or not you have the title. And I think that practical guidance is super important around, here's some tangible examples. As I mentioned, I'm going to steal some myself. But that's one of the really cool things about the book is, like, you can go highlighting and say, I'm going to see how I can practice that particular thing and see if I can do it. And, sometimes it's as easy as showing appreciation, that I know you and I've talked about, for it, of, going through it, something as easy as that, to creating a whole strategic plan and then making sure everyone feels like they're included in that, and guiding them through the process. So it doesn't have to be, it's not a one size fits all. It can be customized to your world and your lived experience.
Yes, I think that's a great point. And originally, when we talked to people about the idea, well, look, you'll get best results if you treat people well, you treat them with dignity and respect. People say, oh, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? You're going to write a whole book about that? That seems. But in practice, it's often, that we haven't thought about the social aspect of leadership. You referred to it before in your example about the moles walking along. It's not just the person at the front, it's all the followers who make the leader great, and the leader in turn makes the people great. It's not that simple that everyone knows how to practice it, particularly when you're under pressure and you're required to get results, and it seems like the best way is, well, just do what I said and it'll all work out. But, in practice, we need to see some role models. We need to see some examples. We need to see some practices that they have. And I'm delighted that you're already starting to steal pieces from the book. And I think that's what it offers, that, there's a bit of you can do a bit of a shopping list, go through and find things that resonate with you that you can make authentically your own practices. In
Yeah,
a
I think
sense,
that,
we're kind of trying to create a movement here towards a more gentle, impactful style of leadership. That's the bit that's exciting me about putting the book out, Elsa.
yeah, and I think that's a really good way of kind of going through it is, you've done the diligence of doing all that research to say here's the case. And the idea is great, but the practicality component is really where I think the secret sauce is. And then for you to be able to say, here's 50 different types of point of views of how that's been taken into action. And could inspire a new idea entirely. But to your point, being respectful and being kind and treating people with dignity sounds super easy. How it reflects it within your own personality, it can be tricky to, if you, especially if you're under the pressure of being a leader and you need to, make a big impact early on. Sometimes the quietest impacts are the ones that end up resonating the most often. So it's a great way to kind of say, here's how you clear through the noise, and here's some examples of how to build that following, and that type of connection with the team that you're servicing, really.
Yeah. And it's really not that complicated. Really, when you look at some of the examples, you think, how simple is giving people appreciation? But what a difference it makes for people to feel valued, to feel appreciated. Something specific they did made a difference. In the book, we talk about that example I gave of Doug Conant at Campbell Soup. In the 9 years in the job, he wrote 30,000 letters of appreciation to people. Might have been a line or a paragraph, but a handwritten note to say that thing you did, thank you very much. The difference it made is just enormous, Elsa. So it's not that complicated, in
Yeah.
a simple example like that.
Okay, so where can people find the book? I know it's on Amazon and it's on a few others.
It's on all of the major digital platforms, so Kobo and Apple Books and Google Books. Amazon's probably the most popular one. We can leave a link to that in the notes if you like, in the email that you send out.
Yep, I will provide it in the show notes and in the YouTube description when this gets released, so everyone has access to it. And then any other last minute takeaways you'd like people to have from the book, aside from go buy it, because I think the practicality of it is really important for you to take, especially coming into 25.
Yeah, well, look, I think that's a great point with the beginning of a new year. I'd certainly urge you to go buy it. Of course, I would say that. But I'm interested in people adopting it as a way of leading. I really think it's a return to something that we really need, to have people uh, bringing out the best in others. In a sense, I was saying before about starting a movement. I'm quite serious about that. I think we need it in our businesses, our not-for-profits, our community organisations. We need it everywhere where people are looking to bring out the best in others and the value that others have got to contribute, create other leaders. So yes, I would urge people to buy the book and join the movement.
All right. Well, thanks again, Brian. This has been such a great conversation. And then for our watchers, let's start a join the movement, hashtag the gentle art of leadership, and see what we get out of it. I think that would be really interesting.
Love it.
Yeah. All right,
Thanks so
Brian.
much,
Thanks
Elsa.
again.
Thank you.